All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ann Reuter, and I am the creative director at RepCap. I hope everyone has had a great day so far and that you've been able to attend some of our other sessions that we've had. There's been a lot going on today. But right now, I'm very happy to introduce our next session and speaker. The next speaker and I go way back. We've been friends a long time. Ave Shalom. She is the director of UX design and comms at Aon. And today we're going to have a really exciting session where we just kind of workshop and talk about design feedback, which is a huge topic. So before we get started, just a quick little housekeeping thing. If you have questions, we'll have a Q&A at the end. So just you can drop your questions in the Q&A section of the chat, and we will hopefully get some time at the end to answer those. So without further ado, I'm going to let Ava take it away.
Great. Thank you, Anne. It's so wonderful that you're able to host this. Just because we go way back, it's just nice to see your face and have a friend in the virtual room with me, helping me present and organize this session. I'm super excited about this topic. Design feedback is something I've been cultivating for so many years. And I think it's a skill that we all struggle with at times. So I often hear, or when someone doesn't really know a lot about design, they'll say things like, I'll know it when I see it, or I know something's wrong, but I just can't put my finger on it. And I've been there. I mean, I remember when I started early in my career, I would get feedback or I'd get designs and look at them, and I just didn't know quite where to start or where to isolate the problem, just because I hadn't cultivated the skill. So in this session, we're going to cover, it's funny. I was trying to hit my keyboard to go to the next slide and it wasn't working. I'm not used to this. So in this session, we're really going to talk about some basic principles and some common design pitfalls and how to resolve them through some of these principles. So really how to isolate the problem and how to define the solution and get at the best outcome. And then I'm going to walk through some helpful feedback tips and give some resource links. And by the end of this session, what I'm hoping is you're either going to be well on the road to becoming a design whisperer or just ready to become a design whisperer out of the gate. So let's get on the same page, first of all. I want to talk a little bit about what design isn't. So design isn't about making things pretty, which it can be an outcome of design, but it really isn't what it's about. It's not a service. I know in a lot of organizations that you'll have this sort of creative services group set up where you submit a form and the designer does something, they send it back to you, and then you kind of go back and forth, and eventually you get your design deliverable. That's okay, and I get why that happens, and we have that at Aon as well, but it really should be a relationship. It really shouldn't be about a service. The other thing that design isn't is it's not a trend, and it's not based on no logic. Like there's underlying principles. So it's not just sort of a subjective preference from the designer or from a design standpoint. I just don't bring my subjective material to this, although I might stylistically have things that I bring to it as a designer. It's not subjective. It really is about a business outcome. And it really is about coming to those conclusions. So really what design is about is communicating and creating experiences. It's about driving reaction and action. And there's an intention behind every element of the design. And if there's not, the design has the potential to not be as powerful. Like if I have someone come to me and say, well, why did you put this piece of content here with a circle around it? I will tell you very specifically why. Typically, there's an intent behind why we do everything, because design is giving power to communication. It's also based on solutions, and it's human-centered. So it's really focused on the audience and making the best experience possible for the viewer and for the people receiving the information, and making that communication powerful for them, and making it delightful often, and having them walk away not realizing that their day was just made by this design. You sort of do it in this subtle way so that people don't recognize it. What you do recognize, and I was talking to my coworkers, Steph, yesterday about Like, you really notice when a design is wrong. You often don't notice when a design is just so right, because it's perfection, right? So now that we have this baseline established, let's talk a little bit about some basics. So I know that a lot of you probably recognize these words and you understand a lot about them already, like scale, shape, line, color. These are things we recognize. Maybe the grid is new to you, or maybe you haven't thought a lot about proximity in design lately, but excuse me. But what I've done is I've created an interactive experience where we're going to go through these basics and we're really going to deconstruct them and look at some common pitfalls with design and how to solution them around these design principles. And you can go to this later as you might want to. If you find this to be useful, research this later. And the link is bit.ly/yabasics. And it's just a short link that takes you into it. I used a prototyping software, so it's not an actual website, but it does have a web link and it is interactive, so you can click through it. And I'm going to jump over to that right now so we can get started. Hang on one second. Let me share my screen. Let's see. Here we go. And I think it's going to take a couple minutes to load. Ann and I were playing with this earlier, and it did take a little bit. So I'm just going to start talking through it while it's loading for you. So first, I want to talk about the interface a little bit. So how I've set this up is it's the different basics. There's about 8 of them. And the 9th one is really feedback tips and some links for you to go to and some, resources that will help you sort of build your feedback practice up. And then what I do in the typical basic, and it's not representative on this one, which is I'll start with an intro, short intro, then there'll be like a problem, and then there'll be a solution or a couple of problems and a solution and some information about how to solve it. So what I'm going to start with is the grid, because the grid is really the skeleton that your design hangs on. And I think that sometimes people don't realize that there is a structure that typically we start with as designers. And if there's something that feels off with a design, sometimes it's because there isn't an underlying structure. And some designers, when they're early in their careers, start out with just sort of eyeballing things or sort of placing things with this idea that, oh, it kind of all fits together and it lines up. But really, there should be some logic behind it. There should be a framework for which things lay upon. And the other thing I wanted to talk about with this grid is the Z pattern. So there's other patterns like F pattern you might see with web interfaces, but the Z pattern is really about, in cultures that read left to right, you start on the top left and you go to the right, and then your eye sort of goes down the page to get its information. It's just how we've been programmed to read things. So you really want to focus on a top-down approach when it comes to design, and you want the graphics to help direct the eye through the story in this sort of Z shape. If it's right to left culture, you literally just flip the design, like not like backwards type, but like you flip the formatting so it's right to left in the same sort of backwards Z format. But it really does help tell the story with the design. And if you don't see this happening in a design, that might be one of the issues. So this next example, I'm showing you what it looks like with the design on the grid. So you can really see how the content, you just got the content in as the designer, you placed it on the page in the structure. And then I show an example with the design without the grid, and you can really see that it does have an underlying structure. So the next basic I want to talk about is scale. So I love this ad. This is an iconic Volkswagen Beetle ad, and you've probably all seen it. And if you haven't, that's fine. You're seeing it now. But it's really using scale to the maximum amount of its power, I think. So the idea is this ad is like, think small. And then they made this little small Volkswagen Beetle on the top, upper left of the page. So it really kind of has this nice asymmetrical balance. And it really does bring power to the statement, to the message. It draws you to that statement and defines it really well. So typically with scale, the issues I see, and I'm going to say this example is very much like an infographic. It could be a PDF output, an image, that kind of thing. But these principles really apply to any output. So if it's a video, if it's interactive media of sorts, if it's like, I don't know, you're a signage, and you're wayfinding through something that's physical, You can use these underlying principles for all these different outputs, but these are just examples to kind of show you what I've seen typically, particularly in B2B marketing. And later we're going to see a web page and social tile and things like that. So in this example, there's a text imbalance that's happening. So when we talk about top down, the top headline is really small and the bottom section headline is really large. So your eye goes directly to the largest thing on the page and really reads that first. And that's not the way we want it to be. Our hook statement is at the top. You really want to get to the bottom, like as a more of a tertiary thing, when you like convert that viewer into your funnel or whatever it is you want them to do. So the other thing that is going on in this page is this top text block is a little bit smaller font size than these middle ones. So you can look at, and then the bottom ones are really small. And sometimes what happens is like the designer wants to emphasize these data points, but you need to get through the story before you get to the data. Otherwise, the data is not going to make any sense. And at the bottom, the font size is really small, which could be because the copy is long and they're trying to fit it into the page. All of those things have solutions, and they're all about negotiating toward them. So the other problem that I see with scale is that you have an object on the page that's really prominent and it's distracting you from getting through the content in the order that you want people to get through it. So in this case, there's a large object at the bottom, a large graphic, and it's really dominating the design. And my eye goes directly to it. Even though the type is cascading in a really nice way, this object just is anchoring you to the bottom of the page. And you don't really want that. And the other thing that I see with scale is this top right graphic just looks a little squished. You can see on the left, this laurel looks like it's like a good aspect ratio, but this one just looks squished compared to that. What happens oftentimes when we're really detail in the trenches of the design, we'll forget to lock in the aspect ratio when you're resizing an object. So a designer might actually put in the right dimension for the width, but because the aspect ratio isn't locked in, it'll squish it. Just look for things that just look a little off. Like sometimes the circles get squished, so sort of say, that doesn't look quite right. Can you check the dimensions on it to make sure that it's correct? So the solution really is about finding that balance of shapes and objects. So the text is cascading nicely. The largest headline is at the top, the secondary is at the bottom. You have these sort of balance of shapes and sizes going through the page. It just feels like a healthy balance. So the next basic I want to walk through is shape. So shape can have a lot of emotional impact and can really drive the energy of your design. So I'm going to just focus on these 4 shape types at the bottom first. Organic shapes can add sort of this gentleness or nurturing feeling to your design, whereas like a sharp angled shape can be dynamic and add a lot of energy and power to your design. Circles can be like cycles or harmony or family or something that just kind of brings the unit, like everything together as a whole. And then triangles tend to compositionally really make you feel like you have a foundation or you're really grounded or there's trust there. So in these examples up here, they're really using shapes well. And this is actually just a little graphic artist that I found that did this really nice. Like there's a line kind of drawing into this little like very trustworthy mountain, this sort of safe place to go. And then this design here is by Stefan Sagmeister, one of my favorite graphic designers, who did this thing where he took the architecture of the building, the shape of the architecture, and used it for the exhibition. So color sampling from the exhibitions, applying those to that architectural shape. So it really became a good brand recognition, brand consistency, and using color to kind of identify it as specific to those different museum shows. So problem areas I typically see with shape are there's too much of one shape. So one of the shapes is just dominating. In this case, it's circles. So there's circles in the divider line, there's circles all over the page. And it ends up being that you only see the circles. Like you can't get into the content. It takes you a little while because your brain is just processing circle first, and then it's diving into the actual content. Or if it's me, I would just look away and ignore it. So I get bored with things. If it's too distracting, I don't read it. So the other thing I see a lot, and this has to do with like our brand, we always have like these images that are given to us, like these brand approved images, brand approved icon libraries. And what can happen with the designer is if you have some fun creative content that you're rolling out, but you don't really have icons specifically to support it, or you haven't really talked about what that could be, sometimes the designer will just take icons sort of either willy-nilly or just sort of vaguely connect them, and the design looks nice, but it doesn't mean, and it feels off because it doesn't mean what it should mean. Like the graphics aren't reading the same way as the content is reading. So in this case, like design-driven companies have outperformed the S&P 500 by 219%. Pow! Like it's like, what are you exploding on the market? It's just a little bit dramatic for that content. So where you would want to do this kind of feedback is identifying the problem, is reading the graphic and looking at and reading the content and seeing if they marry. And if they don't, really talk to the designer about finding the best graphics and what you're really looking for. What meaning are you and impact are you trying to get with this content? So the solution is really tone down the circles by creating a thinner line and pushing back the space using a lighter gray. There's fewer circles on the page. The icons, this is gonna be a point of negotiation later in the design. So these icons maybe don't seem like they fit the content, but the designer had something in mind, and the designer talked to the copywriter and then came up with this really playful sort of outcome. So this is an example of how you would negotiate with the designer, because they might have an idea for why they put the icons there if it didn't make sense at the beginning. It's powerful what the negotiation can do, I think. So the next basic is line. So line really can direct the eye through the design, and it can create some energy. So in the two examples I have here is this Coca-Cola ad where it's an implied line that shapes the Coke bottle, and it sort of like colors outside of the line, sort of showing that you can kind of rebel by drinking Coke, whatever. And then this life support is kind of fun. It's using that sort of heartbeat monitor and then showing how you can kind of get to a place of health at the end through their services. And so the problem areas that I see with line, and actually this is one I see a lot and it drives me bonkers, but it is something I see a lot, which is the designer put a box around the content because they were trying to kind of isolate it or create a container for it. But the box didn't allow a lot of padding for the text. It's like the boa constrictor to the copy. So it's really like kind of claustrophobic or strangling the copy. It makes it hard to read. It makes it feel a little unsettling to the viewer. So adding more padding to these types of containers can really solve that. The other thing is I'll see a lot of lines. So the designer might be trying to divide out the content really nice. So they add just like these divider lines and section lines and everything. But sometimes it's just too much. Like sometimes it just needs to be like, just pull it back a little bit. And then the third thing I see a lot is directional lines. So things that throw you off of the page. So in this case, the designer was looking for like a Z pattern, like, oh, little arrows that kind of take you down the design. But because of the way it's put together, it's really like sending you off the page dramatically every time you see the arrow. So it's really not encouraging you to read the content below. It's sending you like left and right to look at whatever is there. So the solution, oh wait, let me go back one. This is something I added last minute yesterday, which is, because I see this in photography a lot, is you'll pick an image. So on the lower right side, you'll pick an image and the person has a sight line that's going off the page and not directing to your content. So this can actually really disempower your design. So it's like not driving to conversion, it's actually driving people away from it. So in the solution, really using line to direct you through the narrative. So making it a pleasant experience and emphasizing, creating these sort of focal points of why design matters here and investing in great design. So identifying those main key points of the design and making the line focus on those so people can kind of get through the page easily. And in this case with the photography, picking an image that points to your call to action or points to the message that you're trying to create, and then even finding an image that relates to the content a little bit better. So the next basic number 5 is color. And this is my favorite one. And I struggle with not dwelling too much on this because it's just such a cool design element. So color, what I love about it is very science driven. Our eyes, how we receive color and how we perceive color is different for all of us. Like we all receive information and our brain processes it in different ways. We've just been taught to say this is red and this is green, and we recognize it as that. Hence the like blue dress, black dress, whatever thing that everyone was trying to determine. But the other thing about color that's cool is symbolically it's different. Right? So depending on your culture, a certain color might mean something different to you. So if you have a global market, color needs to be thought about. Like maybe you don't want to use red for this in China. And maybe you have to really think about maybe the different markets need some different color treatments. And the other thing that color is cool about is there are some universals. So how we feel about color, how we feel in response to color, there's universals with that. So with blue, they found that it's a calming color to us. So if you show something that something is blue, you can settle them down. I mean, I think I'm not going to go into architectural design, but if you go into like a hospital or whatever, there's certain colors, specific colors that they've chosen because they're calming. The other thing about color is they can advance and recede. So based on how our eye receives color, it can like pop forward or push back. So if you really want to nerd out on color, just Google Joseph Albers and you'll get a lot of cool color theory stuff that will give you some of the more of this information about how color can vibrate even or appear to even be different if it's set next to another color. But just be mindful of what advances and recedes. And then I recommend with use of color is to minimize your use. So use a primary and secondary color and then use tints or shades of that. So a tint is adding white to a color, shade is adding black, but it really can add that variety if you're just being minimal with your color usage. That way you avoid some of the issues with like a lot of color in a design that can be distracting. So in this problem design, the orange is like in your face because it's an advancing color. And maybe the designer was thinking, oh, it's October, I'm going to put orange, it'll be like fall leaves. But it really does distract from the content, particularly because the primary color is that dark blue and the blue recedes too much. So I'm really only seeing the orange and it's very difficult to get into the copy. So the solution to that is to find that balance. So using a darker blue to enhance the main focal points of your design, and then using the other blues to kind of inline as well to direct your eye through the design, and applying color in a really like pleasant way to the icons and the shapes and objects on your page can bring that variety and flavor, but also direct the eye in a way that you're really focusing on the parts of the page and the conversion that you want from it. So the next basic is typography. So I love this ad by Lee Dorfman, who worked for CBS for a number of years. He created this, I just love this ad. It's he laughs best who laughs last. So CBS had really great comedy ratings for the year. So he used typography in scale to create this powerful image that really supported the content, like draws you right into it because you're like, wait, what is this about? But it represents it so well. And then this example below is using sort of an architectural treatment of typography. So the typography is overlaid on this object that really kind of shows like it's almost like a building that has weight to it. So problems with typography that I see, and this is something I see, these are all things I see a lot. So sometimes the designer has placed the copy on the page and either not applied styles or created paragraph styles for it, or they haven't applied them to everything. So they use the default program font for something and they forgot to change it to be, the brand font. So in this case, like the top font, you can see it's like sans serif doesn't have these like caps on the type. So this top one is a serif font and this is sans serif. You can see it's a sans serif font, but it looks a little different than these other sans serif fonts. And that's because it's Arial. So what happened was the designer went in and that was the default font that it started it with. And then the designer applied the brand fonts to the other things, but it doesn't quite look right. It just looks off. And so sometimes the fonts are just a discrepancy. And the other thing I see is the sort of mixed use of your primary and secondary fonts. So In this case, this middle area, they're using that serif font that was in the headline, but the other things don't. The other body text isn't using that. So the question I would have is like, why did you make that choice? It looks a little off. It doesn't look consistent. So you might want to change that back to a sans serif font. But maybe there's a reason. Maybe there's a reason to create emphasis there for some reason. But typically, this would be something I would call as a red flag a little bit in the design. And then the last thing I see a lot with design is if you have a lot of copy that doesn't fit the design, like if you can't fit it in, designers will sometimes, particularly if you're in your early career, will reduce the letter spacing a lot or reduce the line height. So it's squished top to bottom, or it's squished left to right to fit everything in. The third thing I see, and this one always makes me laugh because I think it's so weird that people do this, but I've seen it like consistently. That's why every time I laugh. But there'll be a requirement like, oh, you need to fit 165 characters in this line of this interface or something, or of this website. So the designer will reduce the font size to be like unreadable. Like, so you can't even really, like, you'd have to have like some serious magnifying glass to see it. That solves the requirement, but it doesn't solve the business problem. So the solutions to this is really about negotiation, because sometimes you need to rework the copy because you really can't fit it in the design. And if you do try and jam it in, it doesn't look good. It doesn't feel good to the user, or to the viewer. So the balance comes here, and this is where the little headlines come in for my icons here. So the designer met with the copywriter and said, I really want to make this playful. I think we could make this content come to life by adding these fun little headlines to support the information. So in this place, it's like rapid growth and extended reach because you're an octopus, and customers bestie because you're loyalty and your closeness to your customer, and leadership, birds of a feather, and any bee can do it. So the other thing that with typography that was done with this is wrapping it around the graphic so it feels like it's part of the of the design. It's more integrated into the design, and then pulling out these data points and making them larger so they're easy to see. So you can say, oh wow, 219%. What is that about? And then the consistency of just like how it cascades, and all the typography is styled similarly with the same fonts, and it's just easy to read. The headlines are all serif. The supporting text is all sans serif. Okay, so motion. This is design plus time. Like, motion really does add a lot to the design process. And I do find that with projects that that involve motion, so sometimes it's like an animated SVG image on your website, or an animated illustration, or sometimes it's like a video, or you're doing like a social tile that's got a recording to it or motion to it. Adding time to a design tends to add time to the project. So it's just another element you're adding with animations and effects and transitions. It does make it adds a level of complexity. So it takes a little longer sometimes to achieve. So I put these in here. I'm not going to pull them up for the purpose of this, but later when you go back here, this video, this is a screenshot of a video that was done through Aon Assessment Solutions that I thought really dealt with telling a story through motion graphics really well. Like, it uses line, it uses transitions, it's all consistent. It kind of brings things to life in this lovely way. Like, I wish every video could be like that. And then this website, I love this company. Envision App does such great things for design, and they have a whole Design Better Co. website that helps you become better in the space, particularly of like web design or marketing websites and those kinds of things. But this website, you'll go there and it's like they animate the text in, and you read it like you're like, oh my God, look, it's moving in the way that I want to read that. And then this little illustration on the right actually animates in. It kind of draws your eye. The one thing I would say is not as successful in this design is that the illustration shows the person looking off the page. I would have like flipped that illustrator. I would have had it illustrated in a little bit more, but still this diagonal line kind of brings you back in, luckily for us. But anyway, I just love this website. I think you guys would enjoy taking a peek at that when you have the time. So here's an example of just motion going wrong, and I'm gonna replay this again because it's loading. But the second, once it caches, it'll replay really nicely. Okay, so I designed this so I can get back. So you can see it's like bouncing, rotating in, coming in from the top and the left and the right. It's just very unsettling and not consistent. And like, why is it bouncing? Like, it's not like a ball coming down and bouncing. It's like a headline and doesn't have anything to do with bounce. So really just like sometimes with motion, people will just use all the bells and whistles because they're there, and it's like, oh, it adds all this energy, woohoo, and it's exciting. And sometimes it's like so easy sometimes with these out of the box transitions to just use them, but it doesn't make sense to the story. So you really have to design with intent, really talk about like, what do we want people to see first? What's the importance of this thing? And what order does it need to come in on? So it's a solution. This is, oh, great. What's going on here? Somehow we lost let me just refresh this. And this is where everything goes wrong. No. Okay. So the solution is, let me just expand this out again, is to really use your transitions and your animated effects sparingly and with specific intent. And you want to not have things go too fast or too slow. So just have a nice pace to it, give people enough time to kind of read a little bit of it, but also show the order of events. So in this case, it's kind of coming in the order that you want people to read it in. It's showing them there's some data and kind of bringing that to life a little bit, highlighting that, and then kind of showing you other things on the page. So it really kind of gives you this sort of almost like predetermined order of events in a way that's calming. So it's not just in your face. It's just sort of like, here you go. I gave you the street. It's for you to read and experience. So that's a really good solution to those kinds of problems. And the last basic I want to cover is proximity. And the reason I'm covering this one, even though there's all these other things I could talk about, rhythm and, just different ways of designing and fundamentals and theory behind it. But the reason I want to focus on this is I see proximity being a problem quite a bit in B2B marketing touch points. So in this example of proximity, so it's all based on Gestalt theory. So when things are clustered together, you tend to see them as a whole. So you see that as like a thing or an object or a grouping that means one thing. So in this case, you can see this Prada ad. There's like ear, over the ear, whatever you call it. And it's actually 4 objects, but it looks like one because of how their proximity to each other. And then this IBM ad or logo by Paul Rand is just timeless. And it's lines. It's just lines that define a logo. But because the lines are grouped in such a way, we see that as IBM. It's really cool. And then here's just a practical example. Like you have 24 circles, but we see them as two groups, So problem areas is this is where I really see this with social tiles. So and I think sometimes social tiles are seen as just like churn this out, but they really, they're the entry point into your webinars or your downloads and all these things on social media, and social media is so important. So really being specific about how powerful your social tiles are and how they animate is I think it's like really important. It's not something that you should just be producing out. But what I see a lot is things are spread out. So, I want to align this to the left and I want to align this to the right and I want the button to be in the lower right. But there's not a lot of content. So it sort of ends up being spread all over the page and it doesn't hold together. It's not easy to read, particularly because in social media, it's just at a glance. So you're going to lose conversions if you don't have things in proximity or you don't have it in that tight kind of format that drives people to click on that button. So the solution to that is to use things with a little bit more intention. So putting things together, but creating sort of like a visual navigation through it. So you're doing with animation, having the content appear in one place the button always in one place, but like near enough that you can read it and then just click on it. So that's difficult to do. This is actually, smaller things are harder to design. Making something complex simple is harder to design. But I do see this a lot where things are, even with templates, you have a template and the content's all weird and you just want to fill the space. And you don't need to fill the space. White space isn't bad. It's really about driving people to read that information. So that's the problem to solve. Read that information and click through. So what I'm going to do right now, this was the last real basic, the last sort of page on this website is just resources for all of you. So you can go back and deal with this, but I'm going to jump back to the deck right now because I'm going to finish up with just feedback tips and some things about what's easy and what's hard for designers. And then let me just get this. Oops, hang on. I got to get the interface figured out here. Stop sharing. And then we're going to go back to the slides. Okay, so I'm just going to finish up with some feedback tips and what's hard and what's easy for designers. And then we'll open it up for questions. So, oops, there we go. So feedback tips. This is your toolkit for delivering the message or talking with the designer. So be specific. I think sometimes we're a little general, like this isn't working or this looks terrible, or, I've heard it all. And it's particularly when I was younger, I used to take things a little more personally. And now it's not about the people, it's about the business outcome. So another thing to be outcome focused is look at the design as an object. Don't look at it as a product of the person who made it. Look at it as the thing that you're going to be putting into the world, and you have a specific outcome in mind. So focus on that, and then be specific about what in the design is wrong. So identify, is it the typography, or is it the object imbalance? Is there something out of balance? Is it top heavy or bottom heavy? And really tell them your expectations. So setting clear expectations is important in terms of like, this is a really high touch point. Set the priority level of it. Like if it's got a really wide audience and it's really important, you need to really give their best in this design. They need to know that. Be clear about deliverables and expectations, and also just when you expect the first draft and the second draft. Whether you want them to just do, just brand it really, basically, because this is not a very important touch point, or make it brand compliant, but like it doesn't need to be heavily focused on because there maybe isn't a wide audience, or this is a presentation that our CEO is giving and it's really important. So you need to like really focus on this one and spend some time. So those are some things that are important. And then the one thing that I think is really, really helpful and very few of us consistently do, or at least it seems like in my experience, we sort of use it and then we don't, but creative briefs can be really helpful because they create a track record, and it's something that someone can always reference. So if a designer can't remember the purpose or the business outcome or some of the details, they can go to this creative brief, and then you can too. So you kind of meet in the middle that way, and it makes you think, what am I using this for? Is this really the output I want? Is the deliverable supposed to be a PDF, or should it be an interactive web page? Like you sort of get at those things when you build out and fill out a creative brief. When you don't know, if you're kind of like in indecision world and you really don't know the path forward, test it. Like that's the best way. Get your customer base or demographic and run some tests and really hear what your customer feels about it, because you can assume things all day long, but you're close to it. You're close to the content and you're seeing it from the inside out. You're not seeing it from the outside in. So sometimes this testing and then you have data, and then you have data to serve up that you can say, hey, look at all the stuff we did and here's data to prove it. But, and then be collaborative and negotiate. And I think this is where things really are a struggle between our different expertise. So we all love what we do, but sometimes we don't realize that everyone else has their expertise and they love what they do. And we're working as a team. So we're strategic partners in this. So your designer is supposed to be working with you and they're helping you make a powerful message. And you need to do that together. And sometimes you need to compromise. And so, it's not just compromise on the design thing. It's compromise on maybe I need to rework the copy, or maybe we need to come up with like a different theme, or maybe this cool design could be themed with this like modified copy. So, or content, or even just like data points. Sometimes I'll say, this is lacking some concrete data behind it. So I might do some research on my own and kind of throw some stuff back over to say, hey, what about something like this? And it really does. I started early in my career being overly confident with what I did. Like, oh, this is the best design ever. You guys just take this, because it's like, no, it's not going to get any better than this. And then I kept getting like cut down. And finally I like over time, like the design through collaboration is always the better design. It's always a powerful outcome. Without that collaboration, it usually can be okay, but it's not gonna be a Volkswagen Beetle ad, you know? So what's hard and what's easy? These are some things that it's interesting. So I get things in my inbox that say things like, well, I know this is going to be really hard for you to do. So hopefully you can get it done in time. And I think like, oh, that's like super easy. Why are you acting like it's hard? But there's like this kind of disconnect for what's hard and what's easy. So I threw together this little list. It doesn't really comprehensively cover everything, but typically making something complex simple is really hard. And I think that's true of any expertise, but or if you're putting together a deck or something where you're trying to summarize stuff, like it's hard to make all the stuff you've been doing really simple. So just keep that in mind though, when you're thinking about timelines for deliverers, give that extra bandwidth of time if it's a really complex project. Reflowing significant copy edits. So if you have a lot of copy, like say it's like a white paper or something, if you're making grandiose modifications to that copy and you need to reflow it into the pages, it's not going to break up the same way. And it does take some time to tweak that and so it fits right again. Creating a template from scratch, really hard because you don't have a precedent. You might have some design vocabulary, which brand typically you have like design patterns and vocabulary you can draw from, but it's still hard to create something from scratch. And time-based edits, as I mentioned, with motion takes some time. Syncing audio and video takes time, unless you have a great audio person who can do that on their own, which I struggle with personally, but easy-ish. These things usually are easy, but they're not always. So that's why the ish part. So theme-based edits using a template. Those typically are easy because you have this master template and you're kind of modifying that. And then styles are already sort of built out. So you're just kind of like plugging in stuff. Things that are out of the box, like transitions and effects that are just very straightforward, typically are easy. Minor text edits, of course, and then style-driven edits. So you have something that's already a style that's in place and you're just changing one part of it, like the font size, and then it just sort of cascades down into your design without you having to modify much. Those are easy. But typically, like there's other things that are hard and easy, and maybe in the next phase of this discussion, now that you're all ready to go out and whisper, I thought we could open it up for Q&A. So if you guys have any questions, if you put anything in the Q&A, I haven't really looked at that, but we can open it up for that right now and see, bring to me your problems and I will find a design solution for your feedback.
Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, just drop them in the chat and we can get them answered. I'll give one while we're waiting for some questions to kind of trickle in. So Ava, why do you think that people struggle with giving feedback on design in general?
So first of all, I thought the article that you bylined for this particular discussion was amazing because it touches a little bit on that, which is, I think sometimes people don't have the words. And actually, this is a really good point. I was going to add that in my feedback tips, which is use your own words. Like you don't have to use design terminology. And I think sometimes people see something, but they're afraid to look stupid or something, or they're afraid they're going to say something that seems too minimal or whatever, but it's all on the table. So I think the best thing is to be mindful of is use things that are meaningful to you, that are concrete in your world, but be respectful. Like, so I did have a designer come to me once because their manager laughed at their design. Like that's not respectful. That's just not constructive. It happens, whatever. I said I laugh when the font sizes get small. That is comical, but I don't bring that to the designer. I usually do that privately, and then I go back and discuss it. So I think really just like, so the circle one that I used the example where it's like too many circles, that literally was the feedback I got on a design from a month ago. She was like, there's too many circles. But because I'm a designer, I can say, oh, that shows me there's an imbalance. Like if you use words that kind of say or identify where that imbalance is in some sort of like human way, typically a designer can identify what that means. So don't be afraid to just say it honestly, what you think. But I think the other thing is like beyond just being respectful, don't make it personal either. Like it's not, you're like I said earlier, it's about the design and making a better design. It's not about how good they are as a designer. It's about coming up with an outcome together. So it's supposed to be collaborative and fun. It's not supposed to be an us versus them situation.
Mm-hmm. So we did have one question come in. So Stephanie is asking, or she's saying, I often find it easier to give specific feedback when something is too much in a design. But what about when you have a design that just is kind of maybe lacking a little and just needs like pizzazz or something else to kind of make it, you know, better?
It's funny because I was in a meeting, like I think it was a year ago, and I was new to the project and I was coming in and they said, oh, well, the business owner said it needs sizzle. That's like using your own words, but it's being really general. Like it's not really specifically saying what they want. And I think that can be hard. Like if it lacks pizzazz, if it lacks sizzle, I think the best way to say it is, I think the design feels flat and it needs to have more activation, or it needs to come to life in a different way. And maybe I would sit down with the designer and look at it and say where it feels flat to you. So you could say, it feels like like if you're really looking at the copy, you could say, oh, it feels like I don't feel like reading the copy because it's way over here, or the graphics seem really dominant, or I'm only seeing, like really focus on what you're seeing and talk through that. But if you need something to like be built out because it's overly simple, that's a tough one because you kind of have to go through and have a discussion about what the content means and maybe look at the business outcomes. So trying to think of a good example. Well, let's take those social tiles as an example. So say I have a webinar coming up and I want to put together a social media package and the copy is like, I don't know, like, join our webinar of that design thinking thing, that example I gave. Sometimes you need like a better image and you can use scale to kind of fill. You can also use white space to your benefit. So maybe think about those design principles and determine like how you can use them to like build emphasis. At Aon, when I first started, we didn't have a big library of imagery to use. And the creative direction I got was, you can use typography. So, you can do a lot with typography, as I showed you. So maybe it's just like creating a bigger emphasis on a word or directing the eye to certain things that kind of build your attention to what you want people to read. There's ways to use scale and motion sometimes, and color can really draw people in and add some sort of that pizzazz to it. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question well, but I think relying on some of those basics and really talking through the content and what you need it to do with the designer, and then just say, hey, do you have ideas? I think the other thing that I meant to touch on in the feedback is give examples. So sometimes if a design seems overly simple, just do a Google search or think of things that you've seen in the world that makes you feel inspired about this kind of topic, and then bring those things in. Sometimes I create a Pinterest board for everything and I just assemble it all in one place. So I'm clicking on links and like add that to my Pinterest, or I sometimes I get PowerPoints from people with images of things that they like. Those are things that can help add some complexity or interest back into your design in almost like an easier way, because you have a visual reference for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like your point about, like, we talked about it earlier, but referring to a creative brief, I think that is one way that you can really maybe even avoid some of these issues to begin with. If you're, you have a documentation that you've agreed on and it's a clear direction for your project. So yeah, I think that's all really good.
Yeah.
So we have another question here from Tracy. So what do you look for in a portfolio when you're hiring a designer for a one-off project?
What I look for is sophistication. Going back to like how hard it is to make something simple. Sometimes I look at how much they can handle a complex situation to make it simple. The other thing I look at in portfolios is if you're filling your portfolio with student work, like things that you did in school, that's okay. But it's nice to see real world applications, because student work really jumps out. Like you can tell it's an assignment, and I've taught, before, so I kind of know what the assignments look like, but you can see when there's a typography project, and that's okay. But I want to see what you're going to do with a business experience. So maybe give yourself some fake projects if you don't have that in your portfolio. That's helpful. I know I need to do that more, because one of the things that's interesting about when you work for an organization for a long time, your portfolio tends to look just like what that brand is. So having a little variety, so maybe play with some different brands. And then specifically, if you know what project you're applying for, I would come up with some examples of what that project probably would have in it. So if it's like, something that's like a campaign package where, there's social tiles or white paper and, a website and other things, show that variety and show that you can put together that package and have that consistency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the real world application is really important, especially when
It's
you're
a tough
looking at
one though.
Yeah, it is tough.
You have to kind of make up, like if you don't have actual work that, or you haven't been hired before, when you're a young designer, it's really hard. Well, you know this, Anne. I mean, we all know this. Breaking in is, or getting that first gig is always the hardest.
Right. So let's see here. So we have another one. So how do you work creatively within the context of a company's brand?
That's a really good question. So I'm not like a very, so this is Ava's recommendation. Might be, if you talk to a brand director, they probably may not agree with me, but they might. But I like to look at brand as a guideline, brand guidelines. I mean, it's meant to give you structure. It's meant to give you a visual library to work within. There's always brand stretch. There's always, in a sense, like, I don't want to use the word loophole, but I'm using the word loophole. But there's always ways to kind of get creative if you really need to for something. So I'll give you an example. I built this interactive wall for a conference. So it was taking an innovation idea and then putting skinning the brand on it. And it was something that was really different and it wasn't in the brand guide, like how to do it. And a lot of the things in it weren't part of the brand guide, but it was using that as like a foundation to build up this innovation piece to it. So infographics is another example. A lot of times brands kind of let you push and pull with infographics because they're such a vague kind of defined thing. So sometimes you can kind of get away with, making things more creative and interesting. And then the other thing is really look for what your brand is. So think about the tone of your brand and think about where you could put emphasis. So typography is a great example. If you don't have a lot of imagery, focus on typography and making that interesting using scale and shapes to support it or mirroring those shapes or something. There's a lot you can do with kind of playing with those guidelines and seeing what you can expand them to. And I think the third piece is really become friends with your brand team. People tend to not want to make friends with brand, like your whoever owns your brand, because they think that they're just going to lock down everything or say no. But they don't. I mean, they might say no to some things, but they want to open a window for you too. They're really there to grow the brand too. So if you're sharing with them and you're working together more, you can actually do more creative things than you would be if you were just kind of sneaking around and breaking the rules all the time.
Great. So I think we have time for maybe one more question. We have about 5 minutes left. So Mary Jane is asking, what questions should I be prepared to answer from a designer when I ask them to design a social media package? But I think you could kind of expand that broadly, like with any project, like what kinds of questions should someone be prepared to answer that are design related?
I think that the creative brief is a good place to start for that. But I think mainly talking about the purpose, like what is the business outcome and who's supposed to be getting it. I also think like it's important to describe to them how high of a touch point it is, and also sort of your expectations. Like you want it to be like really creative, or you want it to be a little bit more traditional. If the audience is your target audience is, where they're at in their careers. So you need to know whether it's like an older generation or a younger generation of audience. So that might kind of imply what they might come back to you with. And if you have any particular examples of things that you've seen that you like, that you want them to kind of focus on in that design, like examples that you found that you like, even within the organization that you think is cool, you can say, oh, I'm looking for something like this, but it's for this target audience. So I want it to be, youthful, or, using the kind of color spectrum of this. You could even bring in colors from your brands that you think are good for your business line. So at Aon, we're so big that we all have different big, color primary, secondary, and tertiary colors we've agreed upon within our business line. So sometimes you have to bring in that kind of stuff, or icons or images that you're interested in. But I think it's best to say these are some tools and some ideas, but allow them to do their job and don't dictate what they're supposed to bring back with, because otherwise they won't put their heart into it. And you really want them to put their heart into it.
Yeah, so I think, again, just making sure that things are really clear from the get-go can avoid, a lot of these potential issues that we've talked about. So we have just a few minutes left. Is there any other things you want to add about, giving feedback, any other, last minute, misconceptions that people might have about the design process, or just any tips, last minute tips or tricks from your years of experience?
Well, it's interesting. I think that the thing that I wish people were more open to is really partnering with the designer. I just think it's more fun. It's more you want to laugh on the job and be respectful. I guess one of the things I wanted to bring up too is like, it's a two-way street. So if you really do look at negotiating and partnering, you tend to be more friendly about it and more respectful of the outcome, and really thinking about the human-centered part of this. So sometimes with my kind of feedback grouping, I'll sit with the team and say, but what does this mean to me, the user? Like, what if I'm the audience? Like, why is this important to me? Let's look at it from that perspective. So those are some things some tools you can use when you're having these discussions. Like, take yourself out of it. Like, just always take yourself out of it and really look at it from the eyes of the people that will be receiving this, and what is their life like, and how can you make it better through just having a good experience with your design or with your brand. I think those are really important things to think about when you're talking through stuff or talking through designs.
Yeah, so true. Well, that's time for us. Thank you so much, Ava. This was great. We will wrap it up here. Make sure you check out our other sessions. We have a few more going on for the rest of the day, but otherwise, thanks again. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Bye.
Bye.